Well, welcome, everybody, to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck. And, of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future in this segment. An interesting one indeed. We have talked about America and its military, not quite as in-depth as we will this segment. An interesting talk indeed. The work is called America Invades, How We've Invaded or Been Militarily Involved with Almost Every Country on Earth. It is written by Christopher Kelly and Stuart Laycock, and joining us for this segment is Christopher Kelly. He's the former chairman of Chiron Corporation, a retired television executive, but he is also an avid, passionate student of military history. Many of his family have fought in previous American wars, including one who led the ill-fated invasion of Canada. He's a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley, et cetera, et cetera. Christopher, how are you, my friend?
Great. Great to be with you, Warner.
Good. I understand that you were joining us from overseas, so all part of your ongoing worldview, I guess. Well, let's talk about that, whether you're in favor of it and happy about it or unhappy about it. The fact of the matter is, America, historically, we've really been involved, have we not?
We have, yes. My co-author, Stu Laycock, is an Englishman, and he wrote a book called All the Countries We've Invaded. And he maintained in that book that Britain has invaded 90% of all the countries in the world. And I read that book, and I reviewed it, and I sent him a copy of the review. We met, we became friends, and as an American, I was curious to see how America would compare with Britain's record. And so our book is an answer to that same question. We go through every country in the world from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe and talk about how America has been involved in almost every country in the world in some way.
And it begs the question, I guess, and this is sort of a question you'd sort of ask maybe at the end of an interview, but we'll start it here.
Sure.
Overall, on balance, what percentage, in your opinion, as someone as a student of military history, were looking back with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, were justified and worth doing, and what percentage maybe we might have second guessed?
That's a good question. I mean, we tried to be not to be too political and partisan. I mean, I think that when you look back on it, you look back as you do on your own life as well, is that, you know, there are some things in our life that we're proud of and that we're glad that we did, and choices that we made that were the right thing. And then on the other hand, there are some things that, you know, if we had a do-over, we probably would take them on in certain cases. And I think that American military history is kind of like that, in a sense that there's a lot that we've done that has made the world a better place. I mean, here we are 70 years after the end of World War II, and you have just recently the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the death camps, and the D-Day invasion, of course, coming up on June 6th. And so you've got a lot of things that we've done that have been noble and sacrifices for the freedom of others. And at the same time, there are some things that we've done that we probably would want to do over on. I mean, we invaded Russia in 1918 and 19 with President Wilson and sent what they called the Polar Bear Expedition there to get involved in the Russian Revolution on the side of the white forces against the Bolsheviks. And I mean, that didn't work out particularly well. But then, just to take one example.
Give us, and again, as you mentioned, in alphabetical order throughout the book, extraordinary detail here of all these different countries. Any particular hemisphere or any particular continent where you believe we've been generally more successful with these invasions and accomplished the mission at hand than others?
More successful in one. Well, I think Europe. You have to look at Europe. Here we are, 70 years after the end of VE Day, which just was a few weeks ago, and we're coming up on the end of VJ Day and the end of World War II, which was the most costly war in human history. And the thing about Europe is that for the past 70 years, it has been, in general, a peaceful continent. And, I mean, with the exception of wars in Kosovo and former Yugoslavia, there really hasn't been a fight. And when you look at a broader picture of European history, there has been an awful lot of fighting in Europe. I mean, from not just two world wars in the 20th century, but the Napoleonic Wars and the 30 Years' War and the 100 Years' War, and that you've been kind of a series of what you might call European civil wars, and for the past 70 years at any rate. The presence of Americans and the victory that we had in World War II, and the fact that we stayed in Germany and made sure that it didn't go back to its Nazi past, and it hasn't, has made a huge difference in the relative peacefulness of this continent, I would say.
Again, if you just joined us, we got a good one going here. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the Flight Deck, of course, of Lewis at Large Radio and Smart Talk Radio. In this segment, we're talking to Christopher Kelly. He's the co-author of a brand new work called America Invades, How We Invaded or Been Militarily Involved with Almost Every Country on Earth. He is a former chairman of Chiron Corporation and a retired television executive. He's also a passionate military historian. Well, let's pop around here and some of the more interesting countries that we probably as Americans don't make that list when we think of countries we might have invaded. Tell us a little bit about America's military involvement in Jamaica.
In Jamaica, let's see. Well, when you talk about military involvement, we talk about things that are not necessarily invasions. That, for instance, with Portugal, we've had bases on the Azores since World War II, and they're still there. Because the Azores are a bit of land in the Atlantic where there isn't much land for refueling and things like that. So that's a case of military, of what we call significant military involvement. In terms of Jamaica, we've had Navy ships patrolling there in the War of 1812. In the 19th century, you had various things. You had people running guns to insurgents in Cuba in 1873 that American Navy got involved with. Various kind of small things, and then we had a little naval air station in Jamaica on a place called Little Goat Island in Jamaica. So we've had kind of involved in things like that. Jamaica also offered support when we invaded Grenada in 1983 during the Reagan administration too.
What about, I'm curious, again, as you said, the title is called American Invades, which sounds like we're imperialistically going in and trying to do all these big military operations. A lot of these are just simple, we actually had military presence there. For example, the country in Monaco, again, it's known for a lot of different things, but we did, in fact, have had some forces in Monaco. We
did. We actually, in World War II, Monaco was invaded by the Italians, and then afterwards, after 1943, by the Germans. And when we were liberating, shortly after D-Day and Operation Dragoon, which was the landing in the south of France, also in 1944, we also fought in Monaco as well briefly. It's not a big country, and it wasn't a big battle, but we did have U.S. troops there. In Monaco for a while.
You are, again, right now, you are actually in Great Britain, and our relationship with them has been, it's historic, it's well documented, but share with us from your perspective why the American relationship, military and otherwise, is so unique and so long-term with Great Britain.
We have what they call a special relationship with Britain, and we fought in 2 world wars together, and we have a very close bond, I think, with Britain. I think they're one of the closest allies we have on, with the possible exception of Canada. They're right up there. Now, but does that mean that we've never invaded them? Well, as a matter of fact, it doesn't. Even going back as far as 1778, John Paul Jones, who is regarded as the father of the U.S. Navy and is buried in full honors at Annapolis now, he was commanding a sloop called the Ranger, and he launched a raid on a town called Whitehaven, which is in Cumbria, which is what used to be the coal-producing part of the coal-producing region in England, and he raided. Now, with this raid, it happened in April 1778. No one was hurt, no one was killed, but a coal ship that was in harbor was burnt. And so that happened in 1778. Then you fast forward to 1999, the town of Whitehaven, which is a somewhat depressed town, decided to start a festival, and they officially pardoned John Paul Jones for the raid, and said that the United States Navy is welcome to have the freedom of the harbor and can visit any time, so to speak. So, and that festival has actually earned more money for the town of Whitehaven than anything else in its recent history, I'm told.
What about America's first major invasion in 1741 in Colombia? Tell us about the background about that and how that might have a special place in American history.
Sure. 1741, of course, this is long before there is the United States of America. There's no American Revolution yet. But there is a war going on. It was between the Spanish and the British, and it was called the War of Jenkins' Year. And there was a British commander, Admiral Vernon, and he led an expedition to what is today Colombia and an assault on Cartagena. And in that assault, there were about 3,500 American colonial troops that participated. One of them happened to be a gentleman by the name of Lawrence Washington, who was the older half-brother of George. And he must have spoken highly enough about his commanding officer to his brother that George ended up naming his home Mount Vernon in honor of the leader of that very first, what we determined as a very first American invasion way back in 1741.
Wow. What about referred to affectionately as the American food fights, the pig war in Canada, the watermelon war in Panama, and the pastry war in Mexico? Give us our Lewis at Large listeners a little background on those.
Sure. I mean, war, of course, is a costly business and often has tragic results and is expensive in terms of time, of lives and treasure. But on the other hand, there are some wars that are kind of ridiculous, I guess you might say. I mean, we have had, and some of those are what we call the food fight wars. The Pig War, which almost broke out in 1859 between America and the United States over in an island from my home state of Washington State, in the San Juan Islands. It was a dispute over a pig, and the only casualty of that war was a pig, but fortunately, I mean, there was kind of a move to creating a bigger war, but both sides ended up backing down. The Watermelon War, that was in Panama. There was a tourist, and that was also in the 1850s. There was an American tourist who was somewhat inebriated who took a slice of watermelon from a Panamanian fruit vendor and neglected to pay for it. And, I mean, it caused a riot, and in the course of the riot, about 15 people were killed. I mean, it really is more of a riot than a war, but it is called the Watermelon War. And then the pastry war was in Mexico, and that sounds like something out of Monty Python. But there was apparently a pastry chef who had a dispute, who was French, who had a dispute with the Mexican government, and then the French got involved, and they were owed money by the Mexican government, and actually the Americans ended up sending a ship from our Navy to Mexico as well. So that's kind of the pastry war in a nutshell.
So are those named by you, or are those named by history?
No, but yes, those are what they're known to. I mean, you can look them up, and they're in our book in the respective chapters, in the Canada chapter, Panama chapter, and so forth. But that's what I mean. They're known as you can look up the Watermelon War and see what happened there too. Yeah.
Greg, as we start to Chris, as we start to wind down here a little bit, again, from your perspective, and I know you have researched this extensively, but tell us one particular military invasion, a true military invasion that you believe has been one of America's greatest successes. And then, again, as we wrap up, maybe the one that if we could take one back, this would have been the one.
Sure. Well, okay, for a success, I mean, think of many of your listeners, I'm sure, are driving in Kia cars and Hyundai automobiles and using Samsung mobile devices, perhaps. And none of that would have been possible if Douglas MacArthur had not launched an invasion at Incheon in South Korea that really turned around the Korean War. I mean, because you might have had we have today to deal with the prospect of North Korea, which is a difficult regime to say the least. But I mean, there was the possibility, had we not at least so to speak, tied the Korean War, that North Korea would control the entire peninsula today, and that didn't happen. And as a result, I mean, I think the world is materially different because of that. So that would be one that to say that it had made a major difference in really improving the way the world is today. One that I think we would take back probably is the deployment in 1983 to Lebanon of the Marines that were blown up in the bunker in Lebanon, who were subsequently withdrawn. They were on a peacekeeping mission, and I mean there were about 300 Marines, several French soldiers killed as well. But that one, I mean, it's hard to put that in a rosy light, I would say.
Well, the work is a fascinating one indeed, an amazing compilation of American military involvement around the world over the years. The title is called America Invades, How We've Invaded or Been Militarily Involved with Almost Every Country on Earth, written by Christopher Kelly and Stuart Laycock. Chris, how can people get a copy of the book and find out more about the research that you've done?
Thanks. They can find the book on our website at americainvades.com, also on Amazon as well, in ebook form as well. And I should mention that 5% of all proceeds are going to military charities as well. We are a vet-friendly organization.
What's on tap for you next?
I actually am working on a sequel. It's at the editors right now, and in the fall it's going to be out, and it's going to be called Italy Invades, How Italians Conquered the World. And I think it's going to be full of surprises. I mean, that 1 in 12 American soldiers in World War II were of Italian ancestry, for example. And we're going to be talking about things like that, among many others.
Well, we appreciate your time and insights, and best of luck, and we'd love to have you back on again.
Warner, it's been a pleasure.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.